Thank you for that warm welcome. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I won't make you repeat it. I hate when people do that. I had the chance yesterday also to get a little bit of a backstage tour, and I spent some time with the visualization studio. That has got to be one of the coolest things I've ever seen in my life. And, you know, I have to say I've been a lot of places, I've done a lot of things, and this is probably, as far as my 16-year-old son is concerned, the second coolest place I've been. Unfortunately, you guys are somewhere a distant second past the video game company I work with. But other than that, I got a lot of props for this. But I'm very grateful to be here, and especially thankful that such a large group with so many important things to do would spend this much time this morning. I have to be honest with you, I always get a little nervous when I present to engineers because there is one question, my son is studying to be an engineer, that I know is always on the forefront of your minds and should be asked why we're here today. And it's a question I'm asking as well, why? Why are we here in this organization this morning to talk about fear and courage? When I'm usually brought in, it's for several reasons. And as I spoke with Gail and I spoke with some other people in the organization, reviewed just a little bit of data from your employee surveys, it became very clear that the usual reasons why I would be in front of a group like this aren't necessarily the case today for why I'm here. The number one reason why I'm typically brought into an organization such as this is because something's terribly broken. Either engagement's low or there's a turnover problem. Maybe there's a performance management thing that's not working. And I know the workplace probably isn't perfect. It could always improve. But as I'm sure you all know, you're ranked number 7 out of 314 workplaces in the federal government. That's the top 2%. That's unbelievable. And one thing that became eminently clear as I started talking to different people throughout different parts of Goddard is this is a very strong culture. I always ask people, what would you change and what would you not change? And the one thing people would not change are the people and the culture. So that raw material, that energy is extremely strong, so it's not that. The second reason I'm typically brought in is more on the courage side, where the environment may have changed and the challenges that an organization is facing in the face of all this change and all this pressure just seem too overwhelming and too daunting to succeed. And that is definitely not the case here either. I had the chance, in between meetings, I've been here all week for various purposes, to spend a little time at the Air and Space Museum on the Mall. I hadn't been there since 8th grade. And just looking around, it's clear that the things that you do go beyond courage to sheer audacity, is the best word I could think of to describe it. Something is like repairing the Hubble telescope in space. I can't even imagine the challenges that brought. In doing it successfully, then multiple times. Or the Pluto pictures, when you think how far that is and all the things that would have to happen years ago to be able to get that level of clarity, that takes extreme courage. So that's absolutely baked into your DNA. So I don't think it's that. So I started thinking, well, why am I here? What is the thing that is leading Goddard to ask me to come in and talk about this topic? And as I thought about it, I realized the answer came from you and the people I spoke with. This is all taken very personally, is what you told me. That when that mission succeeds, when that rocket lifts off the pad, when that discovery is made, when that first set of data comes in, it's a torrent of emotion. We've heard people say you're giddy all day, that you feel like your spirit and soul is lifting up with the rocket, that even if you're not involved, that this is a team sport, that everybody shares in the success. So there's an incredible passion and fervor here with the mission that you don't always see in other places. You see it a little more in the federal government than the private sector, but not always to this degree. That's extremely strong. The converse of that, every organization has some failures, some problems. It's inevitable. And what I heard very strongly from you folks is it's personal when that happens, and it hurts. And because of that, anything that gets in the way of what you need to do, of what you're being asked to do your part to fulfill the mission, to make sure everything runs safely, smoothly, on time, on budget, on schedule, in the face of increasing pressure, increasing budget limitations, fewer resources, less time. Anything that gets in the way is a threat and is unacceptable. But that's the reality that you need to deal with. And with the desire of this workforce in particular to constantly make things better, more efficient, things that appear to get in the way are where you lead to that vulnerability, that desire to protect your ability to accomplish the mission. I'm not saying that that's where barriers exist, but from my experience, that's a potential area of vulnerability. So with the very, very best of intentions, some of these barriers may start to creep up. So what I hope to do today is give a little bit of information on where these things come from and what I even mean when I say barrier. And what's the theory behind it, what's the progression as it moves through an organization, and most importantly, what are some of the things that you can do about it? So there's two things I want you to keep in mind as we spend the next hour or so here. The first is every barrier, just about 99.9% are created with good intentions. So we're not talking about things people are doing that are evil or bad or wrong. It's simply an unintended consequence of you trying to do what you're expected to do, or someone is trying to do, based on what they're expected to do. And the second is, these are all things that may seem insurmountable, that may seem like these incredible walls and things that are frustrating you that you've dealt with your whole career. But you know what? Before Goddard existed, these barriers were not imposed from on high. These are things you did to yourself. And because they were self-created, they could be taken down once you know the root cause, once you know how it progresses. So let's talk about this a little bit. One thing I found out years ago, I had never thought that fear and barriers and courage would be such a big focus of my life. Back in my prior job, I was somewhat of a specialist. I would be brought into different organizations that had gotten stuck. Maybe their employee engagement had flat and their customer engagement had flat and they had a turnover problem. Something wasn't working. And it was some federal government agencies. It was a candy factory in New Jersey, a bunch of call centers, banks, retail outlets, you name it. All sorts of different industries across multiple countries, different functional levels. And I learned very quickly, you know what? The language is different. Language is very different. But I felt like I was seeing the same movie again and again and again. When you really got down to it, the greatest threat that we were seeing was fear. And it wasn't fear in the sense that people were cowering under their desks. It was that fear I talked about earlier. It was that fear of loss. It was something that I could lose, whether it was respect, budget, headcount, information, or even my ability to further the mission. In some cases, it was something kind of silly. One client, it was ceiling tiles. There was a rule that based on your job level, your office would get a certain number of ceiling tiles of space. And one person was promoted, was given an office that was one row short. And that was such a big deal, that organization, they actually had to rebuild the entire 6th floor of this one building to give him one more row of ceiling tiles. But that sort of thing becomes a big deal in some organizations. It's kind of a silly example, but it shows you how far a large, seemingly rational organization can go. When you start having barriers creep up, they usually manifest first in a sea of don'ts. And you find yourself facing a don't every which way you turn. Like, for example, don't go over budget, but don't be late. Well, sometimes you're going to be late unless you have to adjust for something unforeseen, which may require you to go over budget. So what do? Right there is a type of a barrier. Sometimes these things may work together. Like, for example, don't be the bearer of bad news in some cultures. But at the same time, don't make others look bad. Well, obviously, you can do that in a civil, constructive way. And from what I understand, that happens a lot here, which is great. But there's, in a lot of organizations, that's a very real fear. And there's all sorts of other ones that come up. Don't make a mistake. Don't risk a bad performance review. And so then you always have to ask, are the things you're being held accountable for always in congruence with the things that matter for the mission? It goes on and on and on. But ultimately, the one that should always win is the top one. Don't jeopardize the mission. But the problem is sometimes these things don't always help. And again, every single don't you could trace back to a very legitimate purpose. But maybe there's some unintended consequences, and we'll talk about that more as we go. So I'd like to take a step back briefly and talk a little bit about why these things happen. What's the theory behind this that leads to these barriers that we found in so many different organizations? So the first bit of theory that I'm going to dump on you guys this morning is around how people tend to view gains and losses. This was from some great work by Dr. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky around prospect theory. We're going to come back to that because that's where a lot of this stuff gets wrapped up in. But what's relevant here is that people will look at gains and losses differently. So let's say we're in the fishing business, and you have different departments that do different types of fishing and have different things they're held accountable for. So you have Group A, whose performance metric is the number of fish caught. And then you have Group B, whose performance metric is how many tons or pounds of fish are caught. And you have 1 hour to fish because budgets are tight, time is tight. So you could either go deep sea fishing in the ocean and maybe catch one of those, or you could go to a pond and catch a whole slew of the little guys. You've guaranteed one of the two will fail. Because in one case, you'll only catch one fish, which is unacceptable if you're judged on number of fish. Or you could catch a whole ton of fish that weigh virtually nothing, and the second group will fail. And that sort of thing happens in organizations inadvertently all the time. You see a lot of that between, for example, some of the business functions, which are there to protect the organization, and some of the operational functions, which are there to further the science, make discoveries, and make things happen. But where it really gets interesting is any outcome below what I expect, that reference point, I'll view as a loss, even if it's technically a gain. So let's say that I'm used to getting, I don't know, a 3% boost in my budget every year. And this year I'm told, you know what, Tom, things are a little tight, but we're giving you a 1% boost in your budget. And I had planned my year based on a 3. Well, in classical economic terms, I should be happy because I'm better off. I'm 1% better. And this could be a raise. It could be anything. But let's just say it's budget for this case. So I don't view it as a 1% gain. I view it as a 2% loss because I was planning on 3. Well, what if I'm not used to getting any increase? And I'm told, you know what, we could at least give you a 1% boost this year. I'm thrilled. I'm ecstatic because that's 1% above my reference point. It shouldn't matter. It's the same 1%. But it does because the reference points are different. So that's where some of this comes from. Think of it in terms of, the old corny analogy about what do you see when you look at the glass? An optimist will look at that glass and say it's half full. A pessimist will look at the glass and say it's half empty. Some of the design engineers in the room will probably say it's a design flaw, the glass needs to be smaller. And if there's any IT people in the room, you're probably going to tell them, well, I don't know, just dump it out and fill it up again and see what happens. But the point is, you could look at the same outcome. Different people could look at the exact same outcome and interpret it completely differently. So this is, an overused, tired analogy, but I think it works very well. One of the biggest ways we see this is in what people feel like they own. That's my dog, Oliver, by the way. If you give him a bone, good luck getting it back from him. It's a great illustration of something called the endowment effect. As soon as something is given to you, as soon as you feel ownership over it, then your reference point, if you will, the value of that thing increases dramatically, but only to you. So your desire to protect which I could tell you is his as well, once he has that bone, is going to be much greater than everyone else's. So there may be some assumptions made about, you know what, he can get by with half that bone because there's another dog over there that could use that half. Try telling that to Oliver. And you'll get a very different story. So what we see with head count, with budget, with time, with resources, with office space is a huge endowment effect. Even with program ownership, decision rights. Once you own something, it becomes yours. And it increases in value to you. And that means naturally, just instinctively, especially if you need that in your view to accomplish your part of the mission, again, this is all with the best of intentions, there will be a very natural and well-intentioned desire to protect that. What is really interesting about this is what happens when it is taken away. There's some, going back again to some of the Kahneman and Tversky research, they found that the pain of a loss, again, defined by that reference point, is roughly twice as intense as the joy of a gain. Do any of you have a useless piece of junk in your house that has sentimental value to either you or your spouse that you've had a big fight over? I see some nervous laughter, which means all of you have. I certainly have. But it's a good example of this, that once that endowment effect is in place, it's going to be hard for someone to understand how big of a deal it is if it's taken away, if they don't own a piece of that. So there's very strong loss aversion. So the way it all gets put together is in this very elegant graph that was part of the original research, where the value of the outcome is determined not by the performance on the outcome itself necessarily, but the reference point. There are different people could have different reference points. If you drop below that reference point, you fall off a cliff, and above it's kind of a so what. So there will be a wall that might be built right here to prevent the loss, even if it makes the gain more difficult. I worked with one consumer goods company where, because of one problem, big problem, legal problem, years ago, this was a sales and marketing arm of a large consumer electronics firm. They made it so that signing up a new account took 3 weeks and took 7 layers of approval. Credit checks, forms galore. But that resulted in a lot of lost sales because the competitors could do it in a day. But the reference points were different because of something they wanted to protect. So just one example. How does this manifest? What I've found is the most common reason why these reference points differ. A lot of times it's over budget, a lot of times it's over headcount or information. Most of the time, recently, I've seen it's over time. Let me give you a few examples. You may have a differing reference point. Ensure that you communicate thoroughly with everybody, but you have to do it in less time. Well, those are somewhat in conflict. Always follow the process, follow the prescribed steps, but if something unexpected happened, you have to be resilient and adaptable. Those, in a sense, are in direct conflict. And by the way, these examples came from you folks. Make as many discoveries as possible, but don't take more time. That report has to be sent out when it is. Even though maybe one more day, one more week, you just feel like you're so close, but the report has to go out. And help others, but only if you have time. And then when you add in all these other things, you usually don't. And from what I've gathered, this is a very collegiate, collaborative culture. And as I said, it's a team sport, especially what you do here. So that one probably hurts quite a bit because I'm sure the desire is there to help people. But your main accountability, I'm sure, is your part of the mission. There are also natural friction points within any organization that I'm sure exist here. One of the most common ones are between the operational functions and the administrative functions. Those who do and those who protect. Both are equally important. One defines the organization and how it operates, and the other one actually goes out and does the great things, launches the rockets, makes the discovery, gathers the data, all of that. So you have natural friction points between those two functions. But then even within you're going to have some friction points. So for example, Abby and I have done a few projects for the government with groups such as yours, where you've got a group that designs, a group that builds, a group that deploys, maybe a group that validates, operates, and then analyzes. And that's a natural friction point, because there's things that aren't envisioned, there's different priorities. In theory, it should all hand off perfectly seamlessly, multiple communication lines going back and forth. In a high pressure constrained environment, it's really hard to keep that up and do it well, and not have different viewpoints across those different groups. And then you have all sorts of don'ts flying at you from some of these different groups, from HR, finance, facilities, ITs, procurement, and they're held to the fire on their responsibilities. So they're not being mean, they're doing their part of the mission. Now, you've got people here on the video monitors that represent a whole different set of friction points, potential friction points. Natural barriers always occur just culturally across locations, where something that is taken for granted here may not necessarily work out in White Sands or in Wallop or in New York City. Or maybe it was not communicated with enough input from the different locations. Or vice versa, maybe there's something that needs to be implemented there that could benefit here. But distance creates a potential for barriers as well, because there you have naturally different reference points. You have groups that are operating, doing different things in different places in a different work environment. So that fosters some of these differences as well. So where does this all lead? And why does this then, kind of bringing this all back, how does this get to why we're here? It tends to follow a progression through an organization. And the first step in that progression is what I call parochialism. That is a natural outgrowth of growth. As organizations grow, they become more complex. As organizations become more complex, then you have to start dividing up responsibilities. And as you become more complex, you divide up more and more and more. Maybe you used to just have an HR group. Maybe you didn't even have one to start with. Then it may split into diversity, training, recruiting. Maybe you just have one engineering group, and then that's had to split into design, operate, analyze, and so forth. That's just a natural way to do that. But when you create separate groups with their own accountabilities, you have to put someone in charge. And you have to make that someone's world. And then if you think of the endowment effect, especially if there's pressure to perform, which there always is, that's where that narrowing of focus could start to occur. So parochialism ultimately is that. It's like you start to view things through your lens. It's a very natural thing to do. But if you suspect this other group over here might be parochial, it's because you may start to think that they're more concerned with checking their box or filling out their part of the process than the broader mission. Or that's how it may seem to you. It won't seem that way to them, because in their view, that's what they need to do to further the mission. But it may be getting in the way for you. So that's where you start to see rules and policies that benefit one group, but maybe cause some more difficulty in another group. Maybe you may need something right now, but the procurement process that has to be there is making it difficult. Or maybe you need to travel, or maybe you need to have more open communication with a particular group. There's all sorts of ways that this could manifest. But the world becomes defined by the piece and not the puzzle. I heard a lot about the Goddard Way. And I also heard there's not one interpretation of the Goddard Way. That a lot of people have their own version of the Goddard Way, and that's sometimes brought out to explain why some of these things exist. That's a good example of how this could manifest. It's just the way you view things and the way you want others to view you. So let me give you a hypothetical example, and I'm going to pick on hopefully everybody in the room in an equal opportunity way. So I'll offend everybody by the time this is through. Let's say that someone up high sends out a note saying, you know what, we got to do a better job of taking the trash out. Let's just pretend there's no housekeeping function. So the first view of, let's say, a design engineering team might be, well, we need to design and build a trash receptacle that's easier to empty. The ones we have don't really facilitate that. It's a design flaw. Facilities engineering may say, well, we need to build it into our project workflow and schedule, and make sure that we separate the non-food trash removed twice a week. It's all the programmatics. Well, then there's safety, who may think about, well, we need to avoid putting anything dangerous in the trash and make sure we document all the safe trash removal procedures to make sure that we don't get ourselves in trouble. Procurement instantly may think that, well, we need to compete the contract for trash removal services before we do anything and select the best company, or at least get 3 bids for trash bags. Security may think instantly, we need to ensure the workforce knows how to handle sensitive and classified information so that it doesn't get thrown in the trash, which I hope everybody does. And then resources may think, well, why are we spending more money to acquire trash removal service than was budgeted? So again, I've probably offended pretty much everyone here now. But it just gives you an example of the first instinct when any new initiative comes out. Everyone's going to interpret it about their piece of the puzzle. And if the accountability that's built is simply, did you check these boxes, unless that line is clearly drawn, well, did the trash get taken out, then these don't matter. You could do all these things perfectly and still not solve the problem. So that's where some of these things tend to come. And they tend to manifest themselves in terms of rules. And what I found is there are 4 types of rules. And by the way, I know I'm throwing an awful lot at you guys, and I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for questions at the end. The first type of rule are gospels. Gospels are absolute. Always do X, never do Y. Now, some gospels exist, certainly anytime you work in the federal government. They are mandated by Congress. They're things that you simply have to do. And those aren't barriers. Those aren't the things we're talking about. We're talking about things that you decide yourself. There's other things that are guidelines that are conditional. Many gospels could be guidelines or should be guidelines. One that drives me absolutely crazy is in every call center just about in the world. You call them up and it's just going badly. It's going from bad to worse. They don't solve your problem. They can't solve your problem. They refuse to solve your problem. You're frustrated. They're frustrated. You're about to scream. And what do they say to you? Sir, is there anything else I could help you with today? And my instinct is just say, yes, go to the roof, please, and jump. I actually heard one case where a rep used that as a way to get the customer to shut up by saying, sir, is there anything else I could help you with today? But they have to say that no matter what. Because if QA monitors that call and it ends up not happening, that could cost them their bonus. It could cost them their performance review. It could even cost them their job. So even if it's incredibly inappropriate, it's a gospel. It should be a guideline. It should be conditional. So one thing I'll challenge you is when you're faced with something that looks like a gospel, unless it's mandated by law, protecting safety, protecting classified or sensitive info, I'd ask, again, why? I heard that one of the great things about this organization, which is why I started with the whole why thing, was there's an intense intellectual curiosity. I heard described as you want to be like curious children, always trying to discover why. The same thing holds with rules and policies. Make sure you understand why it's there. And it may be a perfectly legitimate reason. Maybe it is a guideline, but you think it's a gospel. But that's something to think through. And then the other area are ground rules. Ground rules are things that are just lines in the sand that you can't cross. And you can use your judgment. You'll probably be held accountable, as you should be, for what you do, rewarded if you make a good decision. But just don't cross this line. But the most interesting one, and what we're going to cover in the session later, are the ghosts. I would bet embedded in, well, this is the Goddard way, are lots of ghosts. Ghosts are rules that either aren't really rules, they're just kind of the way you've always done things here, and then they become rules. Or sometimes it's someone just said, well, I don't know how to handle this, so let's do this, and that becomes the rule. It's kind of policy by precedent. Or in other cases, it's something outdated that just doesn't apply anymore. If I were to sneeze, what would you say? What's a polite thing to say? Bless you. Why? There's a few theories. I mean, we all do it without even thinking. The one that I tend to believe is that practice originated during the peak of the Black Plague. And the Pope at the time dictated that if someone starts showing symptoms, the first of which was sneezing, you need to instantly pray for their souls. So that's why people started saying, bless you, when someone would sneeze. So if I sneezed, if you thought I was coming down with the Black Plague, I would advise you to simply leave the room rather than saying, bless you. But it's something we do as a ghost that we don't even think about. And organizations are full of ghosts. And again, they're things that you just do without even realizing, again, because maybe it's the Goddard way as far as you know. It's just the way we're supposed to do things here. But I challenge things that ghosts that seem to be getting in the way. Every rule and policy is meant to protect the organization by preventing something. So, and we'll talk about this more this afternoon, but just to give you a flavor, what's it protecting? Is it protecting something you could relate to the broader mission in case, if that's the case, okay. If it's fortifying a parochial silo, yeah, then I think you need to take a closer look at it, especially if it's preventing someone else from doing what they need to do to further the mission. So there's a balancing act here because the instigator of the rule is held accountable for something, and that led to that need. So got to start with the need. It may make you angry. It may just make you think, what the heck are they doing? This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. But it's there for a reason. So trying to figure out what it is. Unless it's a ghost, then the reason may not be there anymore. If parochialism is left unchecked, then that could lead to territorialism, which is the next evolution that we see. When does that happen? During times of scarce resources. Then that endowment effect really kicks in. And you start having people hang on much tighter to what they control, especially as the pressure to perform continues to increase despite the tight resources. The old way no longer applies. But I like the old way. I succeeded the old way. I got to this level in the organization the old way. So you know what? I'm going to keep doing the old way until someone tells me otherwise. Or it's just how I work. I may not even realize it. A time of intense change. One thing I heard from a number of you is, now you guys don't automatically get all the budget. Sometimes it may go to someplace like JPL. That wasn't true in the past. So that's a change. And that may require a different mindset. During uncertainty, when outcomes shift, and when fairness becomes less clear. And you know what? It does. And that's just reality. Each of you may have an idea for an initiative that would help mission success. Let's say in this room there's 30 such ideas, and there's budget to do 2 of them. That means 28 of you won't be able to do that, even though it would make your part of the mission easier, more effective, more efficient. But there's only so many resources. So there needs to be an objective, mission-oriented process for deciding who wins and who doesn't, even though everybody would benefit. And that's just the reality, but then that leads to territorial behavior as well. One of the biggest ways that you tend to see this is in empowerment. And it could go 2 ways. It could be empowerment over the people that you can control or also others that you can control in the next department. And imbalanced empowerment and accountability. You have situations where people are still held accountable, but they lack the empowerment. And by empowerment, I just don't mean technically you're free to make the decision. That's the easy part. Remember the time trap chart I showed in the beginning? That's the biggest killer of empowerment. I would bet every dollar in my wallet that every single person in here would help their neighbor if they could. Anytime, without even hesitation, if they had the time. It's time that is usually the biggest killer of empowerment. Information hoarding is blatant in a lot of organizations. I don't think, from what I've heard, it's as big of a problem here. I would certainly hope not. I don't see how it could, and if you guys still do the great things that you do. But many organizations, you hear things like, well, we don't trust those guys to get that information or use it properly, so we have to dole it out, or we have to control who knows that, or we want to make sure everything's used consistently. And some of those are legitimate concerns, but sometimes it leads to a restriction of access. And business runs on information. Organizations run on information. That's a really dangerous path to take. That's very much an example of short-term thinking or lack of flexibility. It's like, we are under so much pressure, we can't deviate. We just have to keep our heads down and focus on this problem, even though this other group desperately needs us to help them there. So there's a basic difference that's not always clear. Parochialism is how you get others to view you. It's more outside looking in. What's the filter? Have any of you seen the movie Monsters, Inc.? Remember the Roz character? You forgot to do your paperwork. That's parochialism. It's nothing else matters until that process is followed. Territorialism is about controlling what's inside the castle. It's about what the resources that are within your span of control are allowed and able to do. Well, what happens if territorialism is left unchecked? Then what you start to see happen is a threat to self-sufficiency. You know what? We desperately need these 5 headcount, and we aren't going to get them filled for at least 6 months, so let's form our own recruiting function. We need this IT initiative, but that shared service is so backed up, they're not going to get to us till next year, but this guy over here can do it, or we could bring on someone that could do it. Or sometimes it's more overt. You may have a very blatant attempt to take over another organization. So sometimes it's a duplicate function, sometimes it's not, but all these types of things can lead to that. But when you start to see these parallel functions, disproportionate share of resources, blatant information hoarding, or attempts to control or speak for other groups, that's when you know you're in empire building, and this is the toughest one to undo. It's much better to catch it early when you're in the parochialism stage or even the territorialism stage. When you get to here, you've let it go on too long, and you need to act now. One of my favorite examples of this was from a consumer goods manufacturer that made glass cleaner. And they had one of the leading ammonia-based glass cleaners at the time. This was quite a few years ago. They were facing some competition from a vinegar-based cleaner. And I know this group is going to get this immediately. And someone in marketing with a very big budget, who was clearly in the empire building mode, had the brilliant idea that, you know what, if we could come out with a glass cleaner that had both vinegar and ammonia, the chemists are laughing, then we would corner the market. So they hired an ad agency, none of them who took high school physics, obviously, or chemistry, obviously, spent a whole lot of money developing ad concepts, setting up a very expensive test market, and then went to the chemists and said, okay, we need a big batch that mixes together these 2 cleaners. And the chemist said, we can't do that. And they said, well, sure you can. Unscrew this bottle, unscrew that bottle, and pour them together. And they said, well, you don't understand. One's an acid, one's a base. What happens when you mix an acid and a base, everyone? They react, right? And they form a salt or a precipitate. And this particular marketing person had enough authority, again, as an empire builder, to force them to try to do it because they were convinced they were just being difficult. And they ruined $100,000 worth of equipment. And they were still convinced that just because they couldn't bend the laws of physics, they were being difficult. But you have things like this that happen all the time in organizations. And it sounds silly, but I'm sure a lot of you could come up with examples, maybe not as extreme, that you've seen throughout your careers where you have these sorts of things happening. So just to, again, make sure we're clear on what the differences are here, because this is an important difference. Territorialism is about protecting what you own. Think of my dog Oliver with his bone. And you know what? I could chase him all over the house and the yard for hours, and he will not let me have it. So it's keeping things the way they are. Empire building is changing that balance of power. Territorialism is imposing limits over what people are doing now. Empire building is looking outside of your sphere of control and changing what those people do. One defends the current span of control, builds the walls of the silo even more strongly and higher, thicker. The other one expands the span of control, broadens that perimeter. One maintains reference points and one resets reference points, getting back to the prospect theory thing we talked about earlier. So All of these things can be identified. The root causes can be unpacked. We can go through and identify what all these barriers are and start to dismantle them. By, again, understanding what are some of the different reference points, how do people look at different outcomes, what are the fears and pressures, why are these things here? And think back to that trash example. Nowhere on there was any example, take out the trash. But everyone has different parts of that process. So if the link isn't there to the mission, if the link isn't there to the outcome, then it's very difficult to get there. One of the things that was most impressive to me when I was at the Air and Space Museum, you'll think I'm weird for saying this with all the cool things that were there, was the shuttle engine that was on display. I can't even repair my car. But looking at that engine and how complex it was, all I could think of was the cooperation that must have been needed to build that, to be able to do what it does, is just beyond my comprehension. Again, it's a team sport. So breaking down these barriers and ensuring handoffs is absolutely critical, because when you guys fail, it's not like a bank that charged someone an extra $10 or an insurance company that's denied a claim it should have paid. It's on the world stage, and it may represent decades of work. And when you add in the team that worked on it in all those years, cumulatively, it may be centuries of work. So the stakes for you guys are much higher than virtually any organization I've ever set foot in. So I would say the need to address these things are absolutely critical. So let's say you do that. You go in and you remove all the barriers and all these things that have been driving you crazy all these years, all these restrictive policies that you've been hammered on and hammered on and hammered on. All of a sudden now, no comes from on high, barriers are gone. Go on, you're empowered, do your thing. What are you going to do? Well, some of you may take a step back and say, I don't believe it. They say they're gone, but, this person got their head chopped off when they did this. I don't know. I'm just going to wait and see. So you need to be very deliberate about making sure that you understand and manage to the natural types of courage that are in all of us. The first, and this comes from some brilliant work by a guy named Shane Lopez and Rick Snyder out of the University of Kansas, about different types of courage. And there are multiple types. There's also physical courage, which we're not going to talk about here, which actually does apply to this organization in a sense. But let's start with vital courage. Vital courage, and by the way, courage here we're not ascribing good or bad to. It simply is a thing. It's simply an action that involves risk that provides some sort of potential benefit. Vital courage is instinctive in all of us. It's been there for centuries. This is part of where the fight or flight thing comes from. It's instinctive, and it's very inwardly focused. And let's just make the assumption in this case that we're thinking about it in terms of what's best for me, what's best for you as an employee in terms of advancing your career, providing for your family, getting job security, making that discovery something that is for you. Alternatively, there's moral courage. Moral courage is something that's more cerebral. According to Dr. Lopez, this is something that evolved much later. This is prefrontal cortex stuff. And it takes effort. It's learned. It's outwardly focused. It's fighting for an idea or an ideal. So in this case, let's think of this as what's best for the company. If, when the barriers are removed, you're not very deliberate about making sure these two things are in balance, they're going to come right back. Instantly. Let me give you one example from a completely different industry. I did some work with a financial services company, a credit card company, in their collections group. And they had a big turnover problem. Turnover just skyrocketed. And there were multiple reasons why, but one of the biggest could be traced back to a new performance management system that they put in. And by the way, I saw the same thing happen in other sales organizations that I studied. They put in a new system where the manager of the teams, because before it was too disconnected, a big part of their pay was based on the average dollars per hour collected by the people within their team. Makes perfect sense, right? Because then everything's in perfect alignment. The manager is judged by the performance of the team and paid the same way. Sounds great, until it's time to promote someone. And like any other call center, the way that worked is they would nominate someone, the manager would nominate someone when the call would come down to move into an escalation group where they would learn to take the tougher calls, learn all the HR policies, how to manage, how to performance manage, all that stuff, and then within a month or so be placed with their own team. So let's say I'm one of those team managers, and I get the call. You know what, we need you to move someone from your team into the escalation training group. Okay, so I've got one person over here who has clearly the most management potential and is also my best performer, keeping my average really high. So if I move that person out of my group, I've just taken a pay cut because my average will drop. And I know at the end of the year, when performance management review comes, I'm going to get hammered because my numbers went down. It doesn't matter that I did the right thing for the company. My numbers went down, and that's all they're going to care about. So even though I'm displaying moral courage by doing what's right for the company, it's hurting me. It's violating the vital piece. You know, or conversely, you know what? I've got this other person over here I've been trying to figure out a way to get rid of forever. And you know, they're dragging my average down there. They would never be able to be a good manager. But you know what? If I get rid of that person, I've gotten rid of a problem. I've given myself a raise, and I've guaranteed a great performance review. So you can guess what was happening. Bad managers were being seated throughout the whole organization. You know, the few who did the right thing eventually left, and the people who got passed over left as well. And that's what was driving turnover. I wish I thought of the solution myself, but my client did. They gave the referring manager a bonus in excess of the amount that their average dropped by at the end of the year if that person succeeded. And the problem went away like that. Within 6 months of implementing that program, turnover dropped 10%, which is a big number for that call center. So these things definitely can be unpacked. You know, but part of it too is making sure that you remain objective in all of this. And that you keep in mind these are always happening with the best of intentions and give people the benefit of the doubt. And along with balancing that, there are certain things that will enable courage. So one of them is what we just talked about, making sure you align that vital and moral piece. And what I hope to do is start a language, start a dialogue at the end of the session, and have you folks say, you know what, you're asking me to display moral courage at the expense of vital, or vice versa. Hey, is there a tie to the broader mission in why I'm doing this? I understand it'll benefit me, but why am I doing it? Also, you know, and this is as if you are in a management role, make sure that you look at everyone's unique strengths and try to find a way for them to succeed based on who they are. You know, one organization I worked with, the only way that they can reward people who are great at working with customers was to promote them into management where they'd never have to talk to a customer again. And instead of, and there was a need for having more subject matter career paths or you know, in the field expertise type paths, subject, you know, all sorts of options, but it was always manager or not was the only option. If you're not engaged, it's not going to happen. That's not a problem here. You know, ranked number 7 out of 314, not a problem here, but you need to make sure that that's protected. And then when you see courageous behavior, reward it. It doesn't have to be a financial, it doesn't have to be some tchotchke glass thing you could put in your window. If someone likes that, great, do it. Sometimes it's just a recognition. Hey, what you did was fantastic. You know, we need to do more of that. Can we tell that story broadly? The power of a story is huge. So making sure you enable courage. At the same time, beware of the courage killers. That's not my part. There are a lot of different courage killers. Some of the more common ones that I've seen, I'll talk about here briefly. One of the biggest ones is inconsistency. That instantly will cause people to take a step back and not step out of their comfort zone, not take the risk. If you start hearing things like, well, that group over there, they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. Or I got this rating. I had no idea why. I got this bonus. I don't know why I did or not. I just do my job, and then I leave it to those guys to decide if I get it. That's a warning sign that you may have a courage killer and inconsistent behavior. Playing the blame game. Again, this is a team sport. You win and you lose. You live or you die together. Yes, you should look at what went wrong in the process, of course. But when you start hearing things like, I'm empowered but at my own risk. I'm expected to take this risk, but you know what? My head is on the chopping block. Then you're not really empowered. Not really, because again, that's moral without vital. Or if you just dismiss, something that comes from another group, saying, well, what do you expect? It's coming from those guys. So, not going to take it seriously. Did any of you know what fundamental attribution error is? FAE. A few nods. Fundamental attribution error is, again, just an instinctive thing that we do as humans, where if I do something wrong, I'm justified. I could come up with a million reasons why. So if I leave the company, it's never my fault. It's because, the culture was a good fit, this person was mean to me, I was put in a position I couldn't succeed, blah, blah, blah. Others looking at that same situation from the outside will never blame themselves. They'll blame the person. Well, they didn't fit, they couldn't do the job, they weren't up to it, they weren't a match for our culture. And that's just a very natural thing. Instead of taking a step back and saying, well, what was the root cause that led to this person leaving or this problem or this failure or this inefficiency or whatever it is you're trying to get to. So beware fundamental attribution error because it's just automatic. It's just what we do as humans. Hoarding information. We've talked about this one before. If you start hearing things like, well, they need the information, but we don't trust them to use it properly. So we have to be the ones to jump in and do it, but we don't have time. Okay, you just guaranteed failure. Or they have the info we need, but they won't let anyone access it. Public floggings. And this is when it gets personal. When you hear people say well, it's your funeral. Go ahead, but, I wouldn't stick my neck out. Well, think back to all those don'ts we have. Don't jeopardize the mission. What if you have bad news? It is incumbent upon you to tell somebody. But if you think your head's going to get chopped off if you do, you're going to hesitate, and that's really dangerous. Or look what happened to that last guy. I'm keeping my mouth shut. Let someone else speak up. Again, equally as dangerous. The power of a story is huge, as I said, positive and negative. So the courage piece is absolutely critical. Subjectivity. Again, I know I got an award. I don't really know why. It should have gone to this other person, or I'm glad I got it, but I don't know why I did. Or even worse, what? I did the exact same thing as that person. We got the exact same results. They got recognized and I didn't. So you're going to be less likely to take that risk again. So these are different examples. The last one I'll talk about is excessive control. This, of course, is in a territorial environment where you may hear, or it could be parochialism too, where you hear things like, all memos have to be approved by the head of the department first. All memos. This came from a project Abby and I worked on within the federal government, and it was just paralyzing, this one organization, where nothing could leave this group, even the most simple communication, without the head of that office signing off on it, and sometimes they may be out for a week. So things would just grind to a close. Or even though it's an emergency, I'm not empowered. My boss would kill me if I jumped in to help because I had to be heads down on this. And you know what? Sometimes that's the right answer. Sometimes it's not. So again, it's thinking about what should be the case. I was fortunate enough a few years ago to fly out from Coronado to the Nimitz. That was an amazing experience. You're in the little carrier onboard delivery propeller plane backwards in the dark, not knowing when you're going to land because there's no windows. And then you hit the wire, and we went from 180 miles an hour to 0 in, I think, 1.8 seconds. So I think I now know what a bug feels like when it hits the windshield. So I got out. I was completely disoriented, but once I kind of finally got my bearings, first the little kid in me was like, this is freaking cool. Just seeing all the planes taking off and all the jets. But what really impressed me wasn't even so much that. It was the people. I was watching these 18 to 20-some-year-old kids, just kids really, on something shrunk down to the size of a couple football fields, and essentially running one of the world's busiest airports flawlessly. And I don't know if you've ever been on a carrier, but everyone's got these different colored shirts and they all have their different jobs. It was like watching a ballet. Everyone handed off perfectly. Everybody knew why they were doing what they did, what happened before, what happened after, and it was all focused on safely launching and capturing that plane. Everything was focused on that. And the most impressive thing was when I went around and talked to different people throughout the ship. And it didn't matter if it were the pilots or the ordnance guys or even the people in the mess hall. They were serving the food. Everybody said the same thing. They said, what we do here is the most important thing on this ship. And it's the most important thing because it allows this to happen. And that this was always related to the mission. If it was the mess hall guy saying the pilots need to be well fed and alert, or it didn't matter. Everybody knew how what they did fit. And there's no reason at all why every organization should be just like that. So that's the challenge I'll put out to you. How do you know if that's in jeopardy? What are some of the things that might be getting in the way of that? Maybe you've stalled on a few key performance indicators or are starting to fall behind. Maybe it's getting harder and harder to innovate. I heard a company that was very deep into Six Sigma that was known for its innovation, I will leave their name out of this, so structured and overly mandated how innovation would take place that innovation simply died. So you need some freedom to be able to think and act if you want to continue to discover and innovate. If people are not collaborating effectively, it's usually not because they don't want to. It's because something's preventing it. Rapid growth, think about to that early slide about the progression, is a time when you're vulnerable. If responsibility structures or the operating environment has changed. If you already have too many silos. If process starts to overshadow outcomes and people view success as checking their box even if the outcome isn't received. If I check that box and I do my part of the process, but the mission fails, I've failed. It's a team sport. You can't say, well, we lost that game, but you know what? The left tackle did a good job. The loss shouldn't count on his record. No, it's going to count on the team's record. Or you feel like you could do more. And that was something I heard very strongly. It was almost a restlessness when the people I spoke to here. It's like, we could be better. We could do more. We could discover more. We could get to that next level. And I think that's part of the fuel that feeds you, is that drive and that desire. That's my other pet. That's my cat, Harry. He's a little evil, as you might guess. But as I was wondering when I saw him on my computer, the first thing is when you come across a barrier, take a step back and say, what's the intent? Why is it there? Don't just assume it's there for no reason, because it might be, and the reason could be valid. Someone else may feel absolutely under attack, just as you feel under attack by that barrier. So start by taking a walk in someone else's shoes and think through a series of questions. What do you think that barrier is trying to protect? What's the fear that led to it? What are unintended consequences that may have resulted that are hurting your ability to succeed? What fear do you think drove the creation of that barrier? And how can you either help to understand it, assuage it, do your part to overcome it? And who else is impacted? Because it may not be just you and the originator. But ultimately, you have to answer this. It's got to be all about the mission. How does the rule, practice, or procedure help to further the mission within the operating constraints that are simply the reality of how you have to do your work? So if you could just answer some of these questions, you could really start to get through. But you have to pass the hurdle of what I call the mission and values test. The one gospel I will say never compromise are your values, ever, period. Yeah, that's a very slippery slope that you never want to set foot on. So within your values, upholding your values, even though sometimes it's a tough decision, that's the first thing. And secondly, make sure that whatever decision you're making, whatever rule you're putting in place, whatever you're asking your people to do, how does it relate to the mission? Who else is impacted? Did they understand why you're doing it? Have you asked them, hey, if we do this, how will it impact you? Because the need may be valid, but there might be a better way. So as you go through and think through these things, when we're brought in to look at barriers writ large, there are several steps you need to think through. And so as you start to think about these things, I would encourage you to kind of follow a similar line of thinking. Immerse yourself as much as you can in that other person's world where the barrier is coming from. Or if you're having to make a change, think of it from their perspective. What are their policies, procedures, and systems, and how will it be impacted? Do a little exploration if you're worried about it, or if you think there may be a barrier within your span of control. Talk to people. I mean, that's what we do. It's kind of hard to do if it's highly cross-functional, but to the extent you can, asking people is a very powerful thing. And then if there's multiple, what we would typically do is prioritize and strategize for removal. But a lot of the stuff, at least for the ones within your control, you can start to unpack yourself. So I've got just 2 minutes here left. So, I wanted to leave with just a few thoughts. The first is things are changing rapidly. Your workforce is changing rapidly. I know you have a more seasoned group. That's a very large part of your work group, and a younger group that's coming in. And there's different reference points, naturally, that come with generational factors, locational factors. I think back to when my son, Devin, was, maybe 5 years old, and I'm not trying to belittle the incoming workers here, so take this analogy lightly. But just to point out how different assumptions are. I was working at my computer, and he comes to me and said, Daddy, let's play the Scooby-Doo mystery game. I'm like, Devin, I can't. I gotta get my work done. And that wasn't the answer he wanted to hear. So, because he wanted the computer. And he said, well, I'm sure your dad let you use his computer when you were my age. And I said, well, Devin, we didn't have computers when I was your age. So he looks at me really confused, and he says, well, how did you connect to the internet? And I said, Devin, there was no internet when I was your age. So he said, oh, that's right. You were born before there was electricity. So the generational factors are very strong. But at the end of the day, I love this quote from President Rieger in one of his State of the Union addresses. There are no constraints in the human mind, no walls around the human spirit, barriers to our progress, except those we ourselves erect. So all of these things that seem so difficult, so hard, are things that have been created here. And if they've been created here, guess what? They can be taken down. It won't be easy. It may take some compromise. It may take some effort. But you have the raw material. You have the drive, the mission focus, and the commitment. So this could be an incredibly courageous and barrier-free workplace if only these things are taken care of. So thank you very much. I hope this was helpful.